Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Adrienne Harrell, and I'm the Learning and Talent Development Manager for UC Santa Cruz, and I will be moderating this university forum, Leading Humans in the 21st Century. Before we fully get underway, I want to acknowledge that the land where UC Santa Cruz sits is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. Today, the Amamutsan tribal band, which is comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Land acknowledgement is important for recognizing history of stolen land and presence of indigenous peoples and their enduring relationship to their traditional homelands. The University Forum here at UC Santa Cruz is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of our research to the community and to the social, economic, environmental, and political issues, proudly featuring the impact of research conducted at UC Santa Cruz. Before we begin with tonight's discussion, I'd like to share a few details about tonight's event. We welcome your questions, and because we are using a webinar format, we will not have a chat function. However, you will have an opportunity to share your questions, and we invite you to submit them into the Q&A box at any time. Now, on to sharing a little bit about tonight's panelists. With the welcome to our speakers, I begin with Mr. Michael Lopp, who is a veteran Silicon Valley-based engineering leader who builds both people and products at historic companies such as Borland, Netscape, Palantir, Pinterest, Slack, and Apple. While he's not deeply worrying about staying relevant, he writes about backpacks, bridges, people, leadership, and werewolves at the popular weblog Rands in Repose. He currently works at Apple on Things, and Michael is the author of 3 books, including Managing Humans, Being Geek, and his most recent book, The Art of Leadership, Small Things Done Well. In his free time, he rides bikes in the mountains, splits wood, and drinks wine amongst the redwoods of Northern California, because staying sane is more important than staying busy. Thank you for being with us this evening. And Alexander Wolf has served as Dean of the Baskin School of Engineering and Distinguished Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at UC Santa Cruz since 2016. Wolf received his master's and PhD degrees in computer science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, before going on to join AT&T Bell Laboratories as a member of the technical staff. He was a professor of computer science at the University of Colorado Boulder for 14 years, where he held the Charles V. Shelkey Endowed Chair. Wolf spent another decade as a chaired professor at Imperial College London, prior to which he co-founded and taught the Faculty of Informatics at the Università della Svezia Italiana in Lugano, Switzerland. He has also served as a distinguished visiting professor at the School of Software at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and a visiting professor at the Università di Roma La Sapienza. My Italian isn't very good. Wolf's technical interests span the areas of distributed systems, networking, and software engineering, and he has served as a consultant and advisor to universities, tech companies, and a number of science and technology institutions in Europe. He is a fellow and former president of the Association for Computing Machinery and a fellow of the IEEE and the British Computer Society. Wolf currently serves as a member of the Computer Research Association Board of Directors and the American Association for Engineering Education Public Policy Committee. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome both of our panelists, thank them for being here. And I'd like to open with my very first question. And I think we'll go ahead and start with you, Michael. But I think who or what inspires your leadership?
Just simple. There's a whole set of leaders that have inspired me over the years. So it's hard to pick one thing, but I will. I'm inspired by leaders who take the time to make those they work with better. That's what they do. You just said it. You said in my intro, I build products and people. I firmly believe, and there's many ways to build wildly successful businesses doing exactly the opposite of what I'm about to suggest. But I just firmly believe that every ounce of your time, every minute that you spend investing in your people, your team around you, the people that work with you, above you, below you, wherever they are, that just pays off. And whenever I see leaders doing that, who put the people first, that's always inspired me. And that's why I spend so much time in a very technical field, worrying about the humans. So those leaders who spend the time on that part of the business, that part of the system, are the ones that really inspire me.
Thank you, Michael. Alex.
Yeah, just to expand on that, because I completely agree with Michael. In my own opinion, I think there are really kind of two kinds of leaders, right? There's the leader who sees a problem or an opportunity and believes that they want to attack that problem or exploit that opportunity, and to bring along people to help them accomplish that goal. Right. So in that sense, they're very goal focused, and whatever they need to do to attain that goal will define their leadership. What Michael speaks about, and I think it's very consistent with the academic context in which I live, is that the goal, in a sense, is a bit different. In academia, we're brought up in a world of teaching, of education, of growing talent, and helping people achieve their own goals and their own aspirations. And so the gratification that one gets in that context is from seeing people grow, seeing people develop, seeing people achieve. And so what I would say is, what inspires my leadership is taking that to another level, taking it to a level where barriers are lowered, where things are enabled, things are made possible for people to achieve their goals, and that's my goal. So I'm inspired by that, by doing that, and by leaders that I've seen who share that value.
Thank you both. So let's talk a little bit about leading major organizational changes. I think we can all agree that the past year has provided leaders across all industries the opportunity to grow by leading through unprecedented challenges. Vuca is the acronym that characterizes 4 distinct dimensions that impact leadership at this time: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. So in the context of VUCA environments, what do you see in leadership practices that has changed, or perhaps that needs to change? Alex, why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, there's many ways of approaching that question. I think I think I'll approach it from the point of view that there's kind of a business in academia. There's a service that we provide. There's a function that we support, and a role that we play in society. And I would rather, and this year, of course, has been been crazy. It's been not just challenging, but also eye-opening. It's been very enlightening. And from that point of view, I think I prefer to take a more positive view of it. I prefer to think of it as an interesting set of challenges that might lead to some interesting new outcomes. And so, so there are a few things that I've noticed in my own thinking about it that are very different from before, BC, as they say, before COVID. And those include things like a shortened planning horizon. It's very hard to make decisions with any kind of certainty about the future, and about at a very small granularity of time. And that's very unusual in the academic world, where things usually are at the scale of years. But the planning horizon was significantly shortened. I felt like there was a greater focus that we applied to individuals and individual needs. And they varied so greatly, and people were impacted so greatly, but in different ways. And being sensitive to those impacts to a degree that I had never really appreciated before was something that has affected me. I think it was important too to convey a sense of adventure, in a sense, and experimentation, that we were in a different world, and that there was something interesting about that different world that we could explore together, that we could try to see what we could do differently and how we could succeed in that world. The academia works in a very routine kind of cycle, with very, very well-established procedures and policies and regularity, and this was disrupting that. And that disruption could be taken as a negative, or get taken as a positive, in the sense that, wow, here, let's think that this is causing us to rethink how we might actually do things. And finally, I'd say that I found that I had to accept that commitments were much more fluid, that you could depend on someone or something, but one always had to have the backup plan in place, the generosity to understand that a commitment was something that might not be upheld because the situation was so dynamic. And those things were extremely disruptive, and they I think are going to inform a very different place in academia, how that operates. And I'm very curious to see how it will play out.
I saw Michael shaking his head quite a bit.
A sense of adventure. I think that's probably the best advice, is like, here we are, every month is different now. There's a couple of rules in play that around sort of massive change that you got to remember with the humans. Number one is, in the absence of information, people will make up the worst version of the story that usually reflects their biggest fears. They just fill that vacuum with like weird stories that is there and real, which is why I when it's sort of moving a team, an organization through a lot of change, the rule is just communicate more, communicate until you feel like you're repeating yourself 10 times, and then communicate some more. And nothing has been more true than during these times when everything's changing on a week-to-week or a month-to-month basis. The one of the opposing forces, one of the tricky parts of that is that another rule is that your team, the people around you, because you're the leader, they assume you have a plan. They just do. And very often you do not. So what do you do? What are you supposed to be communicating when you don't know whether there's going to be classes next month or whether your kid can go do work in another country or something like that? You still communicate, and you say things that are perhaps uncomfortable for leaders who are expected to have a plan. You say, I really don't know what we're going to do, but I'm going to think about it. I'm going to talk to whoever I can talk. I'm going to gather the data that I can gather, and I'm going to talk to you again in 3 days. And just it's a calming force that you can apply, even though you don't have a plan. You want to just over communicate. So that's a lot of what I've been doing over the last year and a half, is just making sure people are hearing what I'm thinking, and that I'm also really listening and understanding what their concerns are.
Michael, one of the things I wanted to ask you though is how did you deal with fatigue? And not fatigue in yourself, but in fatigue in the people we're communicating with or are communicating with.
Yeah.
That I found was a real problem.
We really had to, I think the first realization was like we're doing right now. We've been staring at this Zoom window for like 18 months now. This is not normal at all. This is exhausting for everybody, because I can't really see you. I can see you and you're nodding and you're kind of smiling right now. But if we were sitting in the same room, I'd be getting so much more context about how you're sitting and other people around us and all this stuff that our brain is so good at. The Zoom fatigue thing, and maybe you're talking about broader fatigue, was just so amazing those first couple of months. We'd get to 3 o'clock and everyone was going like, this is awful. It's great to see everybody, and we're figuring out how the mute key works, but this is really, really, because your brain is being rewired there. So we made some adjustments in terms of just days where people weren't working, or little things like meetings. This was simple, small things done well. We just start meetings 5 minutes after the hour so that people had that normal like walk in the hallway time. Those little small things, acknowledging that, like, take some time to invest in yourself. Don't back-to-back meetings are not going to be great. Those little edits to the day were good. But also the other piece was just, hey, like, you're off next week. We're not arguing about this. It's like, really, you really need this, right? You're working so hard. Just like, and they're like, oh, I got to do it. I'm like, no, we're going to be fine. And you're going to just have a great time not doing anything whatsoever. So it was being really maybe a little pushy about folks doing self-care, because I think this was also the only thing that we really were connecting. So I think people were really dependent on this in a way that was understandable, but also just exhausting.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of emotional fatigue. It was very hard. It was very hard to bring people to yes.
Yeah.
It was a lot easier for people to say no. And in the Zoom setting, similar to email, it's easier to say no in that world where we're very disconnected.
We did other things as well. We have a WebEx video conference on a regular basis that was just us, just my team. We get together every day at 5:30, no agenda. And it was just, hi, how you doing? What's going on? And it was silly and odd for about a week or two. And then it was sort of a daily blessing in terms of just being able to connect, because we're all trying to rewire to this world of like, how do we gather all this context? We're sitting here stuck in these little 2-dimensional squares or rectangles.
I want to take us back even before COVID, because Alex, I know that your first order of business when you came to Baskin Engineering was to look at how the academic units within the school were organized. Can you talk a bit about how you were able to make the changes that you did after past leaders had perhaps not made those, and why you made those changes, perhaps?
Yes, the school, the school, just to give a little context, is about to turn 25, and so when I joined, it was about 20. It was just coming out of the teenage years, and it had grown very organically and very, in some ways, quickly, and was continuing to do that. And was it was a situation in which the thing had evolved and people didn't quite understand how or why it had gotten to the place it had gotten to, but it was clear that it needed to some sort of rethink. So when I was interviewing, this became very clear to me that that's what the thinking was, that there were others who had tried to bring about that kind of refresh of the structure of the school, but found it to be perhaps a bit too difficult a task to really approach, and had left it. So I thought about it quite a bit, about how could we do this, and I talked to a lot of the staff in the school about it. I was helped particularly in thinking about it with Abigail Khan, who's a very important assistant of mine, and she and I really spent quite a bit of time thinking, well, what is it? How is it that one can take an organization as conservative as a university unit and rethink its structure? So what way that we approached it, I think, was not rocket science. We gave people voice, right? We realized that this was a social process, that in some sense, people realized it had to happen. Some people even knew what the new structure should be. And then what we had to do was really just enable people to get to that place. So we gave people voice. We got people in front of each other so they could talk about it, and they could air a number of the sort of hidden grains of sand in the gears, the hidden ties to structures and assumptions about what others were thinking, and expose those things to each other so that we get to a different place. And frankly, as a leader of this effort, what I tried to do is express that this was going to happen. It was inevitable. And our job is to figure out how to make the best new thing out of it. And that's what we did. And I think that we began by thinking about, well, what are some principles for what a successful thing looks like, right? I mean, it was a design problem. And what we asked ourselves was, well, what is a design? What are the goals we're trying to achieve in this design, right? I mean, who is it that we're trying to satisfy? What principles will underlie that structure? What metrics might we have for success in that? And the conversation elucidated those things and brought them to the front, so that the conversation was more about those goals, those priorities, than they were about, well, who goes where and what's the name of this versus the name of that, right? And I think now, it was in 2018 that it was established, with a lot of consultation around campus, a lot of buy-in, a lot of help, and a lot of faith, I think, in that it would work. And now, 3 years on, it's really settling in. And I think most people, not everybody, most people believe that we're in a better place today than we were 5 years ago.
Excellent. Michael, you already spoke about the importance of communication in leading large changes. Based on what Alex just shared, are there other important leadership principles or practices that you would like to add that you think are important, or that you found helpful in leading an organization through major foundational change?
Yeah, I'm going to twist it a little bit and mostly agree. The question I get asked a lot is sort of like, "Hi, I'm a new person in a running a new team or a new organization. Like, what do I do?" Like, and it's actually similar because you're this new human there running the team or whatever it is. And I always say you need to do 3 meetings, and it's, believe it or not, it's very similar to what he just said. It's the first meeting is, "Hi, I'm Lop. This is what I'm about. This is what I value. And this is why I'm excited to be here." And meeting number 2 is a month later, 2 months later, you go, "Hi, I'm Lop. Um, I've talked to many of you now, and these are the things that I've learned. This is what the challenges that I see ahead of us." And just, it's a draft. It's not perfect yet, but you're demonstrating empathy. You're just demonstrating that you understand the situation that you've gotten yourself into, and you're echoing back what hopefully the organization is feeling and thinking. So that's meeting number 2. And then meeting number 3 is much of what Alex just said, which is third meeting, another 2 months later, probably took longer, but I got to move fast. I get up and, "Hi, I'm Lop. These are the real things that we're going to be working on together, A, B, and C." And then the important part, and at that point, everyone knows that those are the 3 things that you're going to be focused on. The important part is say, "This is what we're going to do, and this is why." Communicate, communicate, communicate. And the most important part is like, "This is how we know this is working." And it's measures, and there's some subjectivity there if it's around like people or org structures or stuff like that. But even that can be like, in a month, I'm going to give you a report card on all 3 of these efforts are going, just so everyone can see, what the plan is, but not just that they trust you as a leader, that you are accountable for it. You can give account of what is important and say, "This is how we're going to measure that piece." I think that part's really, really important. Because they're looking to see that it's not just a good strategy but that we're executing on it really well, and we know what winning or what success looks like there.
Excellent. That's a great segue into my next question, which takes us into leading in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, as white male leaders, how do you establish credibility in leading your institution or organization towards greater inclusiveness and diversity? How do you know that you are recognizing the areas that need to change, given your position of privilege? And I'll let either of you start, but would love for each of you to answer.
I'll go first. For me, number 1 is to understand what you don't know. When a prior company I was working at, we knew that this was something we were really going to focus on, and I can say important things, but the important thing is that I educate myself. So I spent a good quarter spending time with people on the team, people outside of the company, to really educate myself, primarily around bias and just understanding where I had massive blind spots. And I spent time with the team, and as part of an all hands meeting, where I just said, "Hey, by the way, these are the things that I've learned. This is where I have strengths. This is where I need to do a lot more work. And this is the vision that I have for building a diverse, in this case, an engineering team that was going to be diverse, but also was going to practice inclusion but it wasn't in a way that we were just going to talk about it. It was, as I just said, and I said, and this is how you're going to know that I'm doing things here in terms of hiring, in terms of education of people internally. So really give ourselves a report card over the course of multiple years, because this is a long-term effort that we want to invest in. Just make it really clear what's important, again, and how we were going to check in on ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. So, but for me, the really important part was the education, and then the demonstration of the application of that education through my actions.
Yeah, I can add just that for me, hearing was very important. And most people say listening, but I think really hearing what people are saying and understanding the experience that people have that are different from me and that were different from my history and what I went through. So for me, understanding the white privilege was a great challenge. And I say it still is. I mean, it's a work in progress, I have to say. I am still struggling to learn a language that I can use to be fluent in the issues, to be fluent in the language that is meaningful, is sensitive, demonstrates my understanding of the challenges that people are facing in their lives, and the great depth of feeling that from which those challenges come. These are experiences for most people that span generations, that have a history that has informed just the way they've developed since children. And I'm speaking in very generic terms, and many of those experiences, of course, are different. But understanding that depth, and that perhaps some people don't even fully understand their own, where that comes from in their own lives. Of course, it makes it more difficult, but it's also important. So hearing what people are saying, and of course, reiterating what Michael said, educating, being deliberate, being thoughtful about your actions, thinking about how your words land. I mean, these were all really, really important elements, I'd say, of it. And it's absolutely a work in progress for me. I am nowhere near a place where I can feel comfortable and accomplished in my understanding and my ability even to make change as a leader.
Well, I really appreciate both of your candor on this topic, and have a follow-up question, which is, during the uprisings over anti-Black racism and police brutality, many leaders, in fact, were criticized for putting out statements of solidarity that either rang hollow or weren't really backed up with commitments for meaningful change within the organization. And both of you have touched on this, but could you talk about where you feel you have succeeded, and perhaps I will say where you have room to grow as the public face of your organization as it relates to important societal moments like the one we're living in right now? And what advice might you have for other leaders?
A particular failure of mine was feeling or thinking that it wasn't my responsibility to say anything right out of the gate, or kind of like let other folks that are just far more equipped and have a better lived experience. I mean, that was a massive mistake. Not to quickly say something, even though it was something where I'm just like, hey, this is terrifying, and we're thinking about it this way, and just starting that conversation, even though I don't necessarily feel I have something that useful to say. Waiting even a day was a mistake for me. So I went, and unfortunately we had multiple opportunities to comment on this, and I know as soon as something is happening, the sooner that I say something, the sooner I can start a very important conversation in my teams where people can raise their hands or reach out to me, or I can point them at a resource or any number of things. So it's getting that conversation started. Again, we're talking hours matter to folks that are really hurting. So that's something I've and other things as well, but that's the one that first came to mind.
It's pretty clear that this movement is special in the sense that it's one in which action, not words, is what's important and foremost in the minds of those who are concerned with racism, anti-Black racism, police brutality, and in some ways, finding that balance from being able to, as Michael said, being able to show that you give an acknowledgement to the situation, but have it not be hollow in the sense that it doesn't indicate any action that to be taken. But the actions are, you don't want to just sort of have knee-jerk reactions, create a set of actions that are not actionable, not really doable, because you want to be able to follow through with them. You want to be able to make meaningful progress. So I found that timing was very difficult. I think another challenge in the academic world, which is highly hierarchical, was understanding when it was appropriate for me to speak as the dean of a school, as opposed to, say, the chancellor, who is the head of the campus, or the president of the university system, and all of these voices, which could make a statement, but needed to be careful not to step on each other's toes or step on each other's voices. At some point, I decided that, with the help of my staff, who I leaned on heavily in this period, that we needed to come out with a statement that was a set of actions, and a very well defined set of actions, and commitments to progress. And we did that. I'd say we're still working on them. It's hard work, and so it is taking time. And I think it's frustrating to me, and I'm sure it's frustrating to those who heard the words, that we haven't made more progress. But if you're going to make really meaningful changes, it is going to take time and effort. So that's the bottom line for me, is that we're needing to take action and not just speak in palliative, sympathetic words.
I want to just personally thank you both for your courage as we move forward. And we're going to actually just switch a bit and talk a bit about leading distributed teams. Now, Michael, your most recent book, The Art of Leadership, Small Things Done Well, talks about how to set up distributed teams for success. Some of what you talk about relates to managing hybrid teams, where some members are on site and others are distributed. So did you write that part of the book before or during the pandemic? And if it was before the pandemic, what additional insights might you share?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both is the answer. I was writing the book before the pandemic hit, and I'd already at a couple other prior places I built distributed teams. So like headquarters was in Palo Alto, and there was another office in DC or something like that. So I've been thinking about that, but this was a whole new thing because everybody was sitting here and spread out. So there was some religion that I had about distributed teams beforehand, but I had to kind of update it on the fly when we were all sitting here in our respective homes. So it's there's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B there.
Excellent. Now, Alex, as a leader and ultimately as the president of the Association of Computing Machinery, an organization with over 100,000 members around the world, you have already probably had some experience working with and leading distributed teams. Did some of that experience help you navigate the abrupt shift to distributed work and learning at the start of the pandemic for your colleagues and for the students at Baskin Engineering?
Well, actually, the answer is no. And although, right, there are 100,000 members around the world, the ACM actually touches over 3 million people with its work. In some sense, the purpose of the organization is to bring those people together, is to build that community. And the main mechanism, I would say, that is used or was used was the in-person meeting, the conference or the workshop, the symposium, the events that would give an excuse for people to spend time together who would not otherwise be spending time together. And so, in a sense, it's antithetical to the world that we live in right now. And I'm actually concerned about things like professional societies and how they operated and how they can operate in the future. I really don't know what that future looks like. On the other hand, what I see threatened are things like spontaneity, the serendipity of running into someone. Because I remember, conferences, people often not in the rooms where people were giving the talks, but actually sitting in the hallways with each other talking, sitting on the floor, sharing a computer screen and talking about some system that they were building, right? And they were usually strangers at first, but then they found each other. I don't know how you do that in this new world. I don't know how you do social bonding, where sharing a meal becomes part of the exercise of developing a common language, a common set of thoughts that lead to the creativity and innovation that we see. Like, in some sense, engineering is the most collaborative enterprise. Maybe second to politics, but it's absolutely dependent on that kind of interaction. Shared values. How do we develop those shared values? And lastly, how do we deal with accountability? How do we make people and hold people to account? I don't know that we have the social structures that do that, and I don't really have any good solutions to these challenges at the moment. I'm concerned. So, Michael, I'm hoping you can teach us something about that. Obviously, a lot of your work has been in this kind of distributed collaborative work, but it strikes me that it comes from a place mostly of very specific goals with teams that have some very cohesive structure.
I was pretty lucky. The thing I did before Apple was Slack. And it's a very text-based, collaboration solution, but we engineers like banging on the keyboards. And it's fortunately again, I don't think it's for all of the creativity and the serendipity that you're talking about, but I see a lot of companies, teams, and we were seeing this even before the pandemic, that because they had a sort of that connective tissue of that sort of communication medium there, they can really be distributed. And I think a lot of companies, and this is just Michael Lopp speaking here, not former VP of engineering at Slack, I think a lot of companies and institutions really had to figure out, for some things, how that was going to be the means by which we replicate a little bit of that hallway conversation, a little bit of that sort of, cafeteria chat, that sort of. It's not a replacement, but it's certainly. I think a lot of companies and institutions are trying to do that. But I'm with you 100%. That random thought that I get from you because we just happen to bump each other in the hallway, and you say, "Did you know about this?" And what you told me literally changes my product, because you told me this thing randomly that we're going to schedule a meeting. Like, that happens all the time in these environments. And that's a piece that I'm with you. I don't know how we replicate that, and how we, in a world that we're going to be, distributed for a while longer. So I personally am really looking forward to hanging out with people. I love whiteboards. Whiteboards are, they're the best. And get up here, I'm like, this is what I'm thinking. And you're like, no, that's completely wrong. No, I'm on. And we go back, and like those moments of learning, I desperately miss. I'm looking forward to getting back to them.
Thank you both. I'm going to move on to our next question. And Michael, I want to go back to your book. There's a chapter entitled Kobayashi Maru Management, which invokes leadership challenge from Star Trek that highlights the importance of character and decision-making. So for those who don't know, a Kobayashi Maru is a situation that is unexpected, complex, and may have no path to a win. No path to a win. So your advice is to lead in a way that will avoid complex and potentially no-win situations altogether. So can you talk about how to avoid a Kobayashi
Yeah.
Maru situation from developing? We all would like to know.
Well, I want to just thank you for asking this question because it was one of my favorite chapters I've ever written. So I'm delighted to talk about it a little bit. There's a problem. There's many problems with Silicon Valley. One of the challenges is that there's this hero culture where it's like, oh my God, there's this disaster, and now we're going to work all weekend, and we're going to fix the thing, and everyone goes, hooray, we worked all weekend and we fixed the thing, and that's great. No, it's not great. I mean, it feels great because everyone's on Mondays clapping their hands and saying, good job. The problem I have with that is that everyone had to work that weekend, and something broke weeks ago or was not planned for weeks or months ago, that we ended up in this situation where people couldn't be with their families or couldn't do whatever they're going to do that weekend. So I'm trying to get people, my teams, away from this sort of hero culture where, like, okay, everyone, we got to chip in and fix this thing. And I say, sure, we can go fix this thing, but what was the root cause? Why did we end up in this situation in the first place? One of the problems with leadership is no one gives you a round of applause when everything's just working, right? They're not like, good job, everything's totally quiet. We should be clapping a lot more during those times. So the Kobayashi Maru is that kind of complex thought of like, how do we prevent those in the first place? The answer to your question is that is mostly experience. When you start to see these patterns developing in terms of, in my case, like product planning or bug fix rates or these sorts of things, it's to adjust as early as possible before we end up in that situation where we have to work that weekend. Hope is not a plan. A plan is something where you can say, cool, we're measuring this thing and it's headed in the wrong direction. And because I've gone through these situations many times, I know, like, cool, everyone really wants this to work and they're very excited about it, but they just hope it's going to work out. And I've done this before. So let's make some early adjustments there. And it's strange because you don't end up in this sort of scenario where everything is exploding and whatnot, and it's just kind of calmly getting done. And that's actually really good leadership. But they don't clap for when everything's just fine, though. So thanks for asking the question, by the way.
Of course. And Alex, you've instituted many fundamental changes in the leadership team and the decision-making process at Baskin Engineering. Can you talk about how those changes have helped you avoid Kobayashi Maru situations within Baskin Engineering?
Yeah, I can't say that I have completely, but one way to think about it is, at least, or one way I think about it in my context is zero-sum thinking. That's one of maybe the greatest examples of Kobayashi Maru thing. Is that right, Michael?
You got it.
Where people have kind of this feeling that if we give something to that side, we lose something from this side. If this person gets that, then the other person doesn't, loses something, to give something up in order for that to happen. And that is a really, really destructive way of thinking. And so the goal, anyway, is to bring people into the decision-making process so that they are all part of that decision. They all can see themselves, hopefully, they have a stake in the outcome, so that any decision becomes a beneficial one to everyone. That's extremely hard and cannot be avoided in all circumstances. One way to do it, at least in what I've done, is I've created sort of meeting structures or group structures that involve different constituencies so that they can blend or attempt to blend. Giving voices to students, they're usually left out of this kind of leadership equation, but they often are the source of some of the best solutions to situations and come up with the best ideas. And appointing appointing people who actually can think that way and see beyond their own personal issues to more collective and collective thinking. It's not perfect. It doesn't always work, and sometimes that leader who does have to make the decision will get booed. They not only won't get applauded, but they'll actually get booed, and it's just unavoidable. It's just the way it is. And you have to be able to, as a leader, you have to be able to live with that and live with those moments and get beyond those moments and accept that.
Thank you both. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. Before we turn things over to the questions that have come in through the Q&A, I'd like to close out the conversation tonight of at least my formal questions, really thinking about the importance of having good leaders in technology. Michael and Alex, both of you have immense experience as leaders in technology, engineering, and education, as pioneers, practitioners, and leaders. Over the last 25 years, we've seen some amazing technological advances and innovations, including the growing use of artificial intelligence. UC Santa Cruz, being rooted in social justice, liberal arts, and engineering now. My question for both of you is, what is the role of leaders to address who and what gets left behind?
I'll take a swing at this. I think there's, I'm looking ahead at some of the questions, so I'm going to pull in a little bit of it here. I think there's plenty of examples of perhaps, I don't know if the right word is well-intentioned engineers building, tools that are going to affect a great many people with the idea that if this is like, I just want to connect with my high school friends. That sounds great. I miss my high school friends and my friends from UC Santa Cruz. And of course I'd like to be able to do that. But I think the role of the leader is to think of the impact of the things that they're building, the potential impact. And maybe even if you don't figure out, prognosticate, like what could be done with that tool that you're building, is to remember that feedback, even when they're booing, is a gift. The humans are telling you something, and maybe it's, as Alex said, it's like painful to hear, but as a leader, you got to be willing to hear all of the feedback, the positive and the negative. So I think we engineers that are building all of these, we wish they were all great, but when we see that the organism is using it in a way that is hurting people or leaving people behind or twisting the truth, pick your least favorite thing about technology right now, it's your equal responsibility to address that and to figure out, okay, cool, there's some feedback here. Let's figure out what we're going to do to make this better, to make this more inclusive, to make this reach a broader set of folks. So I think that's the hard part right now, is people getting stuck in sort of like, well, cool, I built this thing and it's good. And there's millions on it. There's billions on it now. It's good. So I think you got to be willing to adapt and willing to educate yourself. That's what a leader does.
I think back to an experiences I had at Bell Labs, actually, when I graduated my PhD and I went off to Bell Labs, and it was an incredible experience being at this place where so many things were invented, and here I was, this new PhD in this environment. It was really exciting and intimidating in many ways. But one of the things I noticed about the area of Bell Labs that I was in is that people were working on very small ideas. And I used to joke with my friend who also was working there, small tools for small minds. I used to make fun of it. Small tools for small minds. And those of you who are very familiar with Unix will understand what that means. But what I understood only years later was that what they were working on were things that were affecting them personally, that they saw something that they wanted to get done, so they did it and they built it and they solved that problem that they were feeling personally. Now, that's a wonderful thing, right? I mean, we are humans, we have a lot of shared experiences and needs. And if we are working on the things that we're passionate about, presumably that those needs, if you satisfy those needs, you'll satisfy those needs for a lot of people. Now, Michael and I, obviously, we look a lot alike. And we probably think a lot alike, and we probably have a lot of shared cultural experiences. But we also have a very limited set of problems that confront us. And so if we're the ones who are, or the only ones who are leading this kind of development, then the solutions that come out are going to be relatively narrow. They'll serve us, but who else will they not serve, right? And that's the essence of your question, I think. So the important thing, I think, is that we need to obviously be more inclusive. We need to have more people at the table with different backgrounds, solving the problems that they're facing personally. And if they solve those problems that they're facing personally, then odds are they're solving problems for people a lot like them. And that can only be a good thing. And so I guess I'll close with that thought, and that motivation for bringing more people to the table, more diverse leadership, and attacking of ideas and taking of opportunities.
Thank you both for sharing your time, your stories, your wisdom. And at this time, I want to turn our attention. We do have a few questions that have come in through the chat box or the Q&A. So right now I'm seeing 4. So I'm going to just go ahead and start with, I see a question from Isabel, which is for Michael. And the question is, what would you say is the one critical resource and/or skill managers need to have in order to effectively support staff and staff development in a Vuca environment?
I didn't know what that meant before we started this, so thanks for the education, by the way. I think the thing I'd like to kind of find the essence of an answer. So I think there's many things here, but the first thing that comes to mind, and I think has been really important, especially in this last 18 months of us being stuck in these boxes, is I don't know if critical resource, critical skill. I think I call it situational awareness. What is going on with my team? How are they doing? How are they feeling? I spend a lot of time in these Zoom calls, and I always have a grid of my entire team when I'm doing a staff meeting, and I'm looking at them. I'm seeing, are they nodding? I'm telling a joke. Who's laughing? Okay. And it's just me trying to get a read of these folks. And I think that's one of the hardest parts, because that was something that we could just do automatically when we're all just sort of wandering around the building together. But now as we're all spread out. So that ability just to be aware of what's going on with the team, I think is incredibly important skill during these volatile times, because I'm sure you all have seen versions of just people that you thought you knew, and after 12 months of this, just struggling like in ways that you've never seen them struggle before, whether that was productivity or whatever the story was. And me being able to see that gives me the opportunity to start having a conversation and help there. So that's, I think, my biggest thing that I've been relying on in the last 18 months. You're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. I was muted. The phrase I hear most commonly every day. So the next question is from Sonia, which is, what advice do you have for those of us in middle levels of leadership when leaders above you make decisions that impact those you lead, particularly if those decisions reflect different priorities and leadership styles from you?
I can go again.
Sure.
um, I don't know. When people say right middle management, I think they're kind of like saying middle management. I think middle management is like one of the most powerful leadership forces for good in the company, because you've got these lovely executive types and they're amazing and doing vision and so smart and all this sort of stuff. And you got these like frontline engineering managers that are very in touch with how their teams are doing and what's going on. And then you have this middle management layer that middle management, this is, to me, this is the group of humans that connect the entire company together. It's where all of the information is traveling and all this sort of stuff. So number one, I just want to say, this is not the question. It's like, it's a very powerful position to be in that middle management piece. And you're kind of wondering, why am I not exec? But I'm kind of not a middle front. Anyway, so that's number one. But I think there's, to answer the question specifically, it's what happens when someone gives you some piece of your boss or whatever, gives you a thing that doesn't feel aligned with like what you want to do, what you think the team needs to do. I'll say it for the third time, and I really, really mean it. Feedback is a gift. I delight in telling my boss no. Now, I don't just say no. I say, by the way, this is completely wrong. And let me explain to you why I think it is. And it goes back to what Alex just said about a diverse team. Me saying no, or anyone being comfortable and feeling safe enough to say no, you want to work in that environment where I can have that debate with someone and we can learn from each other, because maybe she'll teach me what she meant with that new priority, or maybe I'll teach her about like, no, oh, I didn't know that. And I think that debate, that conversation is a team that I want to be working on. And again, the more diverse the team, the more of those conversations you're going to have. And this is the amazing part, then you get better at those conversations, at that debate about, it's not easy, but it's a learned skill that you want to get. So that was a long answer.
I'd only answer or add to that answer, which I think is a great answer, by saying, hearkening back to something that Michael said much earlier about communication. It doesn't all go, excuse me saying it in the hierarchical sense, it doesn't all go down. It's not about communicating with those who are, you're leading, but it also goes up to those who are leading you, if you want to think of it that way, up the hierarchy as well as down the hierarchy. And so communicating where you're coming from, what your needs are, what the needs of your sub piece are, what values you're applying, what principles you're using in making decisions, and sharing those upward is helpful. And that goes along with Michael said, is feedback. It's sort of the step before feedback, before the wrong decision is made, or the wrong it's so that the leader who needs help too, the person above needs help in figuring out what the right thing to do is, and they need to know and hear from you in a positive way, constructive way.
Thank you both. And thank you, Sonia, for the question. Our next question is from Ken. And Ken says, as a family therapist, I know the power of multi-generational transmission of ideas, concepts, including the collateral respect and impact. What do you think of the way corporate America maintains, promulgates, and embraces the contributors of leadership over time? As a retiree, I still hear the great sucking sound of time as my former company repeats old behavior and fails to learn from their successes.
And then he says, I spent more than 20 years as a member of the senior management team in a Fortune 100 corporation. I have a story. It's very short. I have a rule that I always tell my teams when doing onboarding that I hope is a counter to sort of what's being suggested by this question, which is if I tell us all my engineers, I say, hey, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, Mary, can you fill out this form? And Mary is an engineer and she goes, why? And the person asking can't clearly explain why we have to fill out this form, I tell Mary she doesn't have to do it. This has gotten me in trouble. But what it does is what I'm trying to do, which is apparently the theme for this entire evening, is that feedback piece, which is I think that process and kind of falling into a way, process is documented culture. It's like, this is the way we've done it, so we wrote it down so that it's important that we do it. But as is being suggested by the question, these things change, like this 80-hour work weeks or working weekends. These aren't at my age, I've seen it change in the last 10 years where it's like, it's really not cool to be, working on the weekends. And we're trying to get to much better sort of work-life balance. But I think it comes down to that basic sort of piece of like questioning, why do we do it this way? Why do we have to work this weekend? Why do I have to fill out this form? And if the answer is, we always do it this way, it's like, okay, that's not actually the answer. That's just habit. And you should be constantly challenging your team to be able to like, and this is again, work and often conflict, but it allows things not to just to kind of fall into a pattern, and it constantly allows them to evolve. So bigger answer than what the question was, but that's the story.
Always love stories.
It's got me in a lot of trouble.
Anything to add, Alex, or shall I go to the next question? Okay, well, we have a question from Terry and a question from Karen. And I'm going to actually combine both of those questions and give each of you an opportunity to respond. So Terry asks, how do you deal with the quality of life issues when working with global teams? Because Terry hated having to attend 10:30 p.m. meetings with team members in India. And Karen also asks, notes that women have lost a lot of ground during the pandemic. And how do we include women in the profession? And says child rearing. So I'll leave those questions to both of you to respond to.
I'm super hopeful that some of these skills that we've learned over the last 18 months can actually be applied to make both of these situations much more respectful. We've learned how to work out of our homes. My case, a lot of tools been used to kind of capture knowledge in places so that people wherever they are on the globe can kind of learn, like, how does this work, or what's the plan, this sort of thing. I think we can, if seeing how it all plays out in sort of this hybrid model, I think we can end up with a lot of situations where either time shifting isn't as a big of a burden because so much of the knowledge is captured somewhere, or in the case of women in the workforce, you can have much more dynamic setups where they can work and it can be respectful of the very real work that they have at home. So I think we learned a lot about how to have a lot sort of dynamic sort of work setups. Time will tell, because I think there will be a lot of folks that'll kind of fall back into old habits, but I don't think it's ever going back to what we would consider to be normal. And I think it's an opportunity to make other changes as well.
Yeah, I agree completely. We have some staff who are really enjoying working from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. And they're able to do it because they're at home. And they do it because that's when it is convenient to work, when they're working around their other responsibility, their other work responsibilities, their homework responsibilities, or even just the joy of being able to spend more time with their families when those families are awake. So it actually is kind of ridiculous if you think about that. The work day is kind of coincident with the time of day when everybody is awake. Your family is awake and you could be spending time with them. That flexibility, I think, is what we've learned.
Yeah.
And rather than what the challenge will be, how do we keep it from being just a creep so that someone is working from 8 a.m. to 1 a.m.? How do we avoid that? And there's a great temptation for that. I remember again in Bell Labs, the reason that we were really happy at Bell Labs at that time, because they were all allowing us, they were going to pay for us to have computers at home and pay for the connections, and that was really expensive at that time. Some people were getting T1 connections to their home because but the hidden agenda for frankly, for AT&T in those days was, well, we can get them to work more than 8 hours a day. That's horrible.
It's horrible.
That is really horrible. And but I'm hoping that that we will learn a new culture, we'll learn a new discipline about our time, that will let us find a good place where we do find a much better balance between life and work.
Thank you both. So this next question is a rather long one, so I'm going to take my time sharing it so you can digest it. So this is a question from Peggy, which begins with, there's a lot of fear in our society of being too addicted to technology, too isolated because tech enables solo entertainment and enmeshment. Yes, the original idea of Facebook was simply to unite people in healthy relationships, but the ability to manipulate people psychologically, as shown in the Social Dilemma movie, is transforming our society into being manipulated for profit, using our precious human attention simply to bring money to corporations. How can you influence tech leaders to safeguard people from being manipulated this way, to channel tech for strengthening the health and humanity of our society instead of entrapping us?
I'll take a swing at this, and I will preface this by saying this is Michael Lopp speaking for himself here and for nobody else. I think to answer a part of this question is, I think that the user needs to understand what she or he is being done with whatever she or he's doing with a tool, like understanding, like, by the way, this is what your data can be used for. And I think that's the piece that, if you, again, Michael Lopp speaking for Michael Lopp only, if you really explain to folks, like, this is why this service or this app or this thing is actually free, they go, wait a minute, that's not quite the deal that I'm getting out of this sort of thing. So I think and it's hard because it's nuanced, but I think that's number one, is just, if you're building a thing, being really, really clear about what your intent is and why you're doing that. And I think that's a hard thing to actually go and do. The other piece, which is sort of encouraging solo. I don't have a good answer to that one there. I really, these wonderful tools, and I love video games. They're increasingly, they're so delightful and so designed just to pull me in and suck me in for days and days and days. To me, I have to have a long discussion with myself very often about truly where I want to invest my time and what is actually important to me. And I think that's part of, I think what leaders need to be doing is, back to the work-life balance piece, is just being really clear with their teams or with the things that they're building about what they value and what's important. So I don't love that answer, but it's okay.
Yeah, there's a piece of it that's individual responsibility and individual decision making, that Michael refers to. There's a piece of it that's that, and that comes from being informed clearly, informing oneself, or having the technology also teach us about itself, right? I think that's something that we can think about doing, so that you can explore the underpinnings of the technology, using the technology, if that makes sense. But there's also a place for society in this. You know, I wouldn't put this all on tech leaders. I would put this on us collectively as a society to come together and make use of the good politics that we as human beings know how to do, and put constraints on ourselves. We can do that. We've chosen so far not to do it, or we have allowed ourselves to build political systems that don't give us that power, or have taken that power away from us. But that's not the fault of the tech leaders. That's the fault of us collectively. And so I would say that, you know, there's the individual piece personal responsibility. There's definitely a piece for the technology leaders to be conscious of the unintended consequences, not just the intended consequences of their technologies, and to at least explore what those mean. And then there's the piece which is the society at large, the public at large, and the political process that helps us manage our behaviors as a naturally exploitive human beings.
Thank you both. I have two more questions unless anybody wants to try to squeeze one more into the Q&A box. But Michael, this is a question specifically for you from Brooke. Brooke says, I work at blank as a UX researcher. You mentioned listening to user feedback. It's not that I don't listen to the feedback. It's that engineering and product won't listen to researchers on the feedback from users. This has been a pivot since COVID. Researchers are quitting in droves. Thoughts on how to pull better levers? It's a crisis.
It's a great question. Yeah, it's, I worked at Pinterest for a couple of years and I learned about, I got a better than my data structures class at UCSC. I learned so much about data science and the researchers that work there, primarily around advertising. But it was amazing to see the things that we could learn about our users, and in a good way, in a way like, hey, you like watches. I'm going to show you more watches because you seem to like watches quite a bit, Mr. Lop. But there was how to frame this. It wasn't that data won arguments. It was that data was valued and it informed arguments. We would use, it was there, and it wasn't pure poetry. There was a data set of folks, and there was the poets who were kind of trying to inspire us and do those sorts of things, but both were equally valued. I don't know, I'm assuming I guess where Brooke works. I would say, and this is just me speaking for myself again, it seems like there was data there, but it wasn't at all informing the choices. And that seems like lunacy to me. Like it's a powerful, as we learned, we know from all of the companies out there making massive amounts of money on it, there's this powerful ability to learn and to educate and to improve your product because of that. So I think it's a great idea. You should quit, go somewhere that's really going to value the important work that you're doing. Go somewhere that is values compliant and is going to really rely on use data for good and for informed decisions.
By the way, this is not an irrelevant question for academia as well. There's a lot of students out there, and in the old days, it was assumed that the professor knew the best way to deliver the information, if that was the method. And professors can learn too. And I think that culture of feedback is also something that can and should be developed in academia in a to a much greater extent.
Thank you both. I think I have our final question for you both. And it's from Isabel. And she asks, Alex and Michael, what are some strategies you've used to promote and support spontaneous and dynamic collaboration across teams and team members in a distributed workforce? And what are some of the ways you have replicated the water cooler?
I really do hope that a chunk of my time and over the coming years has the ability to be hanging with people and being at a whiteboard and doing that. But I do think the world is going to change, and I'm going to have people that I'm working with that I'm never going to actually meet, that I need to have that ability to kind of water cooler with, if you will. So to me, there's this moment that I have with everybody that I work with. I think of one of my directors from Slack. Her name's Julia, and this is when I know that we're getting to water cooler status in the professional relationship. It's when I have a one-on-one with folks, I always ask them at the end of the one-on-one, do you have any feedback for me? And invariably in the history of ever, new folks never have any feedback because they're like, oh, you're the boss and you're kind of scary. And I don't really, and I continue to ask them, and then they realize that I'm not going to stop. And so they finally say something, and it's usually something simple or whatever. But I remember Julia, after an all hands meeting, I'm like, do you have any feedback for me? She's like, you really just screwed up that all hands. And I'm like, I was like, and she was frustrated with me. And I was like, this is amazing in my head. I'm literally, I'm like, we're here, we got it. Water cooler moment, right? Because she feels safe enough and trusts me enough to say something to me. And by the way, I did screw it up. I was not prepared. I was worried about a whole other disaster that was going on. And it was a disservice to my team that I didn't prepare and do those sorts of things. But I'm still delighted because we had this moment, this shared moment where she gave me feedback. I said, thank you for the feedback. Let me tell you what happened. And this is how I'm going to make it better in the future. Those connections with folks, those like random serendipity pieces, those are the relationships I'm building. And I've had to build them with people that work with me at the current place in the last year. And it still can happen. You can still do it. You just got to like let the guard down. You got to make space to have those conversations. It's not a replacement for the 5 of us at the whiteboard for 3 hours, just grooving on an idea. But those relationships can still be built. And those moments of serendipity, those water cooler moments can still be had, even though we're stuck in these boxes.
Micah, you're really embarrassing me because of course I don't do that. And now I'm going to have to do that. It's a really great idea because I do appreciate that kind of feedback. It's just I don't ask for it, and I should ask for it, and I will. But I think there's also a place in these meetings where it can't all be about the business. You do have to leave some space for just chatting, just finding out how each other are feeling, being connected, understanding where people are at by just having a simple conversation that's not bound up in the urgency of the moment.
Yeah.
And making space for that, I think, is really a key.
Thank you both. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Great questions, wonderful responses. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Michael and Alex, thank you both for sharing your stories and your wisdom.
Thank you, Adrian. You're really great.
Yeah, great questions. It was an honor.
And I want to thank my friends and colleagues in university relations who put together this wonderful university forum. I want to invite everyone to mark your calendars to please join us on June 16th for our next crawl lecture, Climate Controversies and Change Points, with Professor and Chair of Statistics Department, Robert Lund, and Professor Herbie Lee. Fun fact, my next door neighbor. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.